Jim Loewen first became aware of Richard Thornton's intimate knowledge of the southern Appalachian Mountains in June 2010, when Richard wrote a series of articles about his experiences when camping in the Chattahoochee National Forest with homeless veterans. They were featured in the national edition of The Examiner. Then in 2013, while watching a rerun of the premiere of America Unearthed, which featured Richard, Jim realized that this Richard was the same one who had written about the lives of homeless veterans. Jim struck up an email friendship with Richard. Then, when the weather was pretty, he and his wife Susan decided to pay the Georgia mountains a visit. They had never been there. They took an Amtrak train to downtown Atlanta, then rented a car to drive up to Dahlonega. Richard didn't want them to see where he lived, so met them in the city's historic downtown. Initially, Jim wanted to interview Richard about the sundown towns. Those were southern towns that made African American visitors leave before dark. Richard didn't know much about the subject. The conversation during the two-day visit soon shifted to the strange events that occurred in northern Georgia in the months leading up to the broadcast of the American Unearthed premiere. Jim and Susan were astounded by the bizarre behavior of the U.S. Forest Service and National Security Agency employees. He asked repeatedly, "You mean my tax payments funded this nonsense?" Jim and Susan urged Richard not to abandon his research into America's Native American history, even though they well understood that he received no income from that effort. For the next 7 years Jim read many of Richard's published articles, then reviewed them. Richard would then receive brief emails that stated, "Great job. Good, enjoyed reading this. Good, but you need to do more independent research and not rely on what others said." Or, "Richard, you can do better than this. You will not have any credibility with those who count, if you don't check your spelling or use awkward grammar."
Most viewers, not living in the southeastern United States, would probably not be familiar with the advanced indigenous peoples in that region. Neither high school textbooks nor the movie and television industries give these fascinating peoples much attention. They were quite different culturally and genetically from the indigenous peoples living in other parts of the United States and Canada. Then there is the natural environment. The complex terrain and geology of the southern Appalachian Mountains create a beautiful landscape, with some of the most diverse plant life on our planet. This region receives up to 74 inches or 188 centimeters of rainfall each year. That puts these mountains in the lower range of the Amazon rainforests.
Appalachia is the anglicization of Panoan words from Peru. Depending on the accent on the word, para, the word can mean either ocean, descendants of, or upper Amazon basin, descendants of. The plural of Appalachia is Appalachian, from whence the Appalachian Mountains get their name. The province of Appalachia figured prominently in the chronicles of early Spanish and French explorers, then disappeared from European maps after 1706. The word survives today as the name of a river in northeast metropolitan Atlanta, which flows into the Oconee River. The Florida Appalachia did not use this word as their name, until they were told it was their name by their Spanish conquerors. The Florida Appalachia were actually Arawak immigrants from northern Peru. Most Florida Appalachia villages had southern Arawak names. The real Appalachia did found a large trade colony town, adjacent to Lake Jackson in Tallahassee, Florida. It was abandoned around 1500 AD. The mistake arose in 1539 AD, when the Hernando de Soto expedition passed through a small trade colony town in north-central Florida, called Appalachian. The Spaniards applied this name to the entire southern Arawak province, when they entered it in the Florida Panhandle.
The Kingdom of Appalachia or Appalachia Confederacy was composed of multiple ethnic groups, under the leadership of the Appalachia. It disintegrated after the double whammy of a horrific smallpox epidemic in 1696 and the Queen Anne's War from 1702 to 1713. Opposing European powers pressured individual tribes to give their first loyalty to that European nation, not their allies in the Appalachian Confederacy. Individual members partially reunited and became today's Muskogee Creeks, Itsati Creeks, Upper Creeks, Chickasaws, Seminoles, Miccosukee, Apalachicola Creeks, Alabamas, Cosades, Uchis, and Kaw Nation. The Appalachee elite had frequently intermarried with Europeans during the late 1500s and 1600s. They tended to assimilate with their neighbors from across the Atlantic. Their descendants still live in Georgia today. The first major gold rush in North America occurred in 1828 within the lands of the former Appalachee Kingdom. In fact, the official location of that discovery was at the ruins of the Temple of the Sun Goddess, Amana, seen on the previous image. 20 years later, Georgia gold miners would take the technology that they invented in the Georgia gold fields to California. Until the mid-19th century, only the mountains in Georgia were called the Appalachians. We will now turn the helm of the ship over to Richard for him to explain the research process that he has used over the past 12 years.
Hello, this is Richard Thornton, your tour guide into the past of the Southern Appalachian Mountains. This program is coming to you from the Nocuche Valley, the largest and most densely occupied archaeological zone north of Mexico. Mankind has lived here continuously from the Ice Age to the present. I'm standing in a field that has grown cultivated plants for at least 5,500 years. What looks like a wooded hill in the back of me is the site of the Temple of Amana, the sun goddess, and the location where Roanoke College survivor El Nadir spent the last decade of her life. Further behind me is Sal Mountain, an extinct volcano. In 1828, the riverbank behind that wooded hill became the official starting point for our nation's first major gold rush. Gold can still be penned from that location. It is washed down from the mountains where the Chattahoochee River begins. Before taking on a tour into the past, I'd like to explain the philosophy that guides my research. I am a professional architect and city planner with 8 years of university training and 3 theses under my belt. Precision and accuracy is paramount in every professional activity that I participate in. If I don't know the answer to the question, I must be honest and say I don't know. My fellowship in Mexico was just the beginning of a lifetime of exploration and learning. Fortunately, my faculty advisor at Georgia Tech required me to keep a daily journal of all my experiences, not just the pre-Columbian architecture. I also was required to take at least 2,500 slides to document those experiences. You see, that is the point. I'm still learning from those memories that were documented 53 years ago. If a scholar is truly honest, there is no time when he or she can claim to know the whole truth. I might learn something tomorrow that will change what I thought was the truth yesterday. Therefore, I have no theories, just a steadily increasing stockpile of evidence. Let's talk about gold. A relatively rare element, gold is a precious metal that has been used for coinage, jewelry, and other arts throughout recorded history. This is because of its beauty and chemical stability. Much of the gold on Earth is thought to have been incorporated into the planet since its very beginning as a component of the planet's mantle early in Earth's creation. In 2017, an international group of scientists established that the gold came to Earth's surface from the deepest regions of our planet. Thus, commercially viable gold deposits today are typically found in current or past volcanic and tectonic zones. The gold was brought to the surface in lava and then concentrated over time as the rocks evolved into quartz with veins of gold in them. In North America, individuals usually attempt to acquire gold by separating gold from alluvial sand. The gold dust in the sands along the streams and rivers come from eroded rocks and upstream. Most corporate gold mining involves the extraction of gold-bearing quartz and separation of the crushed rock from the gold. Both California and Georgia have deposits of yellow, white, and rose gold. These colors are caused by other metals, primarily silver and copper, being mixed with the gold. Georgia is a very rare type of gold known as red gold. It was created by a mixture of gold, red zinc oxide, and copper. The highest level of gold in this red gold is found in the northern edge of metropolitan Atlanta. The farther north in the vein, the greater percentage of copper. At the northern end of the vein, east of Dahlonega, the metal is essentially natural brass. It was used by the Appalachian Indians to make armor for the soldiers, mainly breastplates, plus hatchets, arrow points, and ornamental religious plates. California's gold-bearing districts are enormous, in fact covering more land area than some states. This is the reason that the new territory was able to accommodate over 300,000 gold miners between 1848 and 1861. In 1848, Georgia's total population was only about 900,000. The estimated total number of Georgia's gold miners before the American Civil War was about 30,000, 1/10. Georgia's gold belts roughly coincide with a line of impact between the Eastern American continental plate and a section of Africa's continental plate that collided with it. Far more than in the case of California, Northeast Georgia's richest gold deposits are directly associated with the region's many ancient volcanoes. The oldest of these is the Tallulah caldera, which is roughly 11 miles or 17.8 kilometers in diameter. Very few people, even in Georgia, are aware that the state has a somewhat active tectonic zone. I was fortunate to have as my geology professors at Georgia Tech the two men who mapped the tectonic zone. Yes, northern Georgia has ancient volcanic sites going back 800 million years, but they also discovered that some of these volcanoes remained active much longer than official texts tell us. At least 2 to 3 are still active gas volcanoes. In recent decades, Georgia's major research universities have intentionally hired scientists from other parts of North America and world in order to shake off its provincial reputation. The geologists they hire don't know much about the geology of the state, and they don't care. This could create a problem because the edge of metropolitan Atlanta now reaches into the mountains. Chimney Mountain, 7 miles north from my home, expelled enough hot gases in 2018 and 2019 to kill all the vegetation near the top. In 1886, it erupted boulders and red-hot gases for several days prior to the Charleston earthquake. Around 1700 AD, the volcano exploded so violently that the Creek Confederacy moved its capital about 180 miles southward to Macon, Georgia. Although this information is not in your high school American history book, it is a fact. I have found numerous scoria and pumice lava bombs in the topsoil of my property, plus some deposits of volcanic ash in the rock crevices. In 2013, an international team of scientists from Latin America, Europe, and North America studied the geology, electromagnetic waves, and gravity waves in the Takuchi Valley. This work was filmed for a public television documentary. The scientists discovered a large gravity vortex in the section of the valley near Takuchi United Methodist Church. In 2022, using a LiDAR scan, I discovered a massive sky serpent effigy earthwork immediately east of the Takuchi United Methodist Church. There may be a connection with the gravitational vortex. The scientists think that there are more vortexes to the north and northeast of the valley. They also find evidence that there's a layer of pure gold immediately over the bedrock underneath the valley floor. At the time of producing this documentary, I have no evidence to ascertain who built the sky serpent, why they built it, or when they built it. The Itsamais did worship a sky serpent deity, but that itself does not prove that Itsamai colonists constructed this massive earthwork. Northern Georgia's ancient volcanoes and fault lines are dirty little secrets, but when Mother Nature pitches a tantrum in California, it has potential for disaster that will make international news. Major fault lines cut across many of California's largest cities. There are 7 potentially active volcanoes in California. These mountains are known to have magma pools underneath their cones. Mount Shasta is perhaps the best known volcano in the United States and considered one of the most beautiful mountains in the world. It had erupted 3,200 years ago. Lassen Peak is California's most active volcano. It last erupted in 1921. The mountain has a volume of 0.6 of a cubic mile, making it one of the largest lava domes on Earth. The Long Valley caldera is little known, even in California, but is one of the most dangerous supervolcanoes in North America. It actually consists of a chain of younger volcanic cones that define a depression in the terrain of eastern California. The valley is one of the Earth's largest calderas, measuring about 20 miles long, 11 miles wide, and up to 3,000 feet deep. This monster volcano is only 71 miles east of Coulterville, California. One stark difference between the California goldfields and those in Georgia is that large-scale extraction of gold deposits did not begin in California until 1848. There is substantial architectural, artistic, and linguistic evidence that Europeans began coming to and living in the goldfields of Georgia during the Middle Bronze Age. Whether or not that can be proved 100%, there's no doubt that the indigenous people gathered gold nuggets and gold dust in the sands and processed it for many centuries. prior to the arrival of Spanish conquistadors. Sephardic Jews and Iberians began mining and smelting gold ore in Georgia around 1600 AD or earlier. There are many linguistic ties between the Yuchi and Creek tribes in Georgia and several peoples in northwestern Europe. An important Yuchi tribe in northeast Georgia was called the Tokari. Any speaker of Irish Gaelic would understand the name. It means principal people. Ri is an archaic Gaelic suffix that appears in many place names today in Ireland, such as Derry, Kerry, Curry, and Ossory. On the morning after graduating from Georgia Tech, I embarked on a 24-hour journey to Landskrona, Sweden, to work in a technical exchange position with the city architect's office. My project was the design of a pedestrian village on Veen Island in the Öresund Channel. On the third day there, my boss, Gunnar Lud, took me by boat to the project site to explain its extreme significance to Swedish cultural history. It is below the oldest surviving church in Sweden and contains both Bronze Age and Iron Age shrines. The Carlist community is called Gamla Gardby. It has been extremely successful. Gunnar showed me boulders engraved with Bronze Age petroglyphs. I was surprised to see that some are even today sacred symbols of the Creek people. All of the symbols can be found at the petroglyphic sites in northern Georgia. Most are in the Gold Belt. The existence of identical petroglyphs 4,600 miles apart puzzled me in the back of my brain for decades, but I did not have the time for researching as long as I was running a full-time architecture practice. Here are some examples of the similarity between the two regions. This is a boulder from southern Sweden. This is a boulder from near the bank of the Etowah River in North Metro Atlanta. These are two boulders from County Kerry in extreme southwestern Ireland. This is the famous Reinhardt petroglyphic boulder, which is also found on the banks of the Etowah River in North Metro Atlanta in the heart of the Georgia Gold Belt. They're identical symbols. Tragark Gap in the Georgia mountains contains one of the largest collections of petroglyphs in North America. However, they are different than any petroglyphs outside of Georgia. Here we take a look at just one of the boulders there. Every symbol on this boulder in Georgia Gold Belt may be found at a petroglyphic site near Nyköping, Sweden. Nyköping is on Sweden's southeastern Baltic Sea coast. Its petroglyphs are the oldest in Scandinavia and have been firmly dated to around 2000 BC. Now we come to the Tugaloo Stone, which is found in 1795 overlooking the banks of the Tugaloo River in northeast Georgia, which is the principal tributary of the Savannah River. The engraved stone's locations mark the head of a cargo canoe navigation on the Savannah River. An important trade path linked that point to the Coochie Valley goldfields. The Tugaloo Stone contains engraving of several types of Bronze Age European boats. I am zooming in on one, which portrays a typical Greek warship from that era. It is the type ship that Odysseus would have sailed on in his 10-year journey. Note the circle with X in it to the left of the boat. That was the universal symbol for gold in Bronze Age Europe. What you see seems impossible, but there it is. Finally, we come to an oval-shaped stone-walled shrine that was built in the eastern Scottish Highlands during the period from 3500 BC to 3000 BC. Note the slot in the wall, which is aligned to the winter solstice sunset. Finally, we come to Alec Mountain Stone Oval. It is 1 mile from my house and on the same elevation. Note that it also has a slot aligned with the winter solstice sunset. Life is indeed stranger than fiction. The extraction of gold and exportation of gold artifacts were very important economic activities within the Kingdom of Appalachia. However, its most important export category were greenstone, axe blades, and hammers. The very best greenstone veins ring very close to the gold veins. Whereas Georgia mountain greenstone items spread all over North America, the most gold products headed southward to be traded for salt. There was absolutely no salt deposits in the Kingdom of Appalachia. According to Captain René de Laudonnière of Fort Carolyn, the Appalachia's two principal gold export items were gold chains and gold foil. The Appalachia did utilize gold foil for their writing system and for maintaining government records. He was not aware of any statues or containers being made of gold. Interestingly enough, The Appalachians apparently preferred copper and brass personal ornaments because they were much more durable. Nevertheless, they had customers farther south who did like gold very much. That we have such details on the Appalachians gold industry, you can thank French Lieutenant La Roche-Perrier. In 1564 and early 1565, he spent 6 months leading a small party from Fort Caroline through what is now most of Georgia and also part of western North Carolina. Perrier signed a treaty with the leaders of Appalachia and then was allowed to explore the kingdom. He observed Appalachian men obtaining gold nuggets and dust by shaking alluvial sand in hollowed-out canes. They would also chip pieces of gold from exposed veins in the rocks. He obtained samples of yellow, white, and red gold to show Captain de Laudonnière upon return to Fort Caroline. Ferrier stated that the Appalachians melted the gold nuggets, chips, and grains in the same kilns with which they created their fine pottery. He did not mention seeing any of them pour molten gold into a mold. To date, the only tribe known which has had the skills to pour molten gold, silver, and copper into molds were the Chiska in northeastern Tennessee. Apparently, Lieutenant Ferrier took along a land surveyor in his party. Until 1565, the European nations were ignorant of what lay beyond the Atlantic and Gulf coastal plain. Many adventurers still believed the Pacific Ocean lay a short distance beyond the Appalachians. They dreamed of finding the passage from the Atlantic to the Pacific. After Ferrier returned to Fort Caroline, its resident artist Jacques Lemoyne painted a map of southeastern North America, which was remarkably accurate from the Appalachians to the Atlantic coast. It was the first map to label a gold-bearing region within the Georgia mountains.
The Spanish got a head start on the exploration of the Americas, but during the 1500s only obtained a toehold on the coasts of what is now Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina. Several expeditions into the interior were dispatched from 1513 till 1600. Spanish maps of North America continued to be far more inaccurate than French and Dutch maps. Several expeditions attempted to reach the fabled cities of gold in Appalachia, Upaha, and Cibola. None were successful. In 1513, Juan Ponce de Leon led the first known European expedition to La Florida, which he named during his first voyage to the area. He landed somewhere along Florida's east coast, then charted the Atlantic coast down to the Florida Keys and north along the Gulf Coast. He was searching for gold, silver and gems, but found none. In March 1521, Ponce de Leon returned to southwest Florida with the first attempt to establish a Spanish colony in what is now the continental United States. The town was never built. The native Calusa people fiercely resisted the invaders. Ponce de Leon was seriously wounded in a battle. The colonization attempt was abandoned. He died from his wounds, soon after returning to Cuba in early July. In 1526, Luca Vasquez de Arellon personally funded, plus lead, the construction of the first Spanish settlement in North America. It was probably located on Sapelo Island, near present-day Darien, Georgia. With over 600 colonists, the Spanish government hoped to establish a powerful coastal base with which to trade with the Indians in order to obtain gold, silver and gems from the mountains within interior. The short-lived colony of San Miguel de Gualdape was formally established on the festival of St. Michael, September 29, 1526. An intestinal disease soon began to decimate the colony. Many colonists, including Arellon, perished. At least 80 North African slaves rebelled and escaped into the interior. Of the 600 to 700 people whom Arellon had brought with him, only 150 survivors returned to Hispaniola that winter. Pánfilo de Narváez was the leader of two failed expeditions. In 1520 he was sent to Mexico by the governor of Cuba with the objective of stopping the invasion and arresting Hernán Cortés. The invasion had not been authorized by the king or the governor. Even though his 900 men outnumbered those of Cortés 3-1, Narváez was outmaneuvered, lost an eye and was taken prisoner in the Battle of Zempoala. Many of his surviving men and their female camp followers were captured, sacrificed and eaten by the Aztecs. In 1524, King Carlos V named Panfilo de Narvaez the leader of an expedition with the mission of exploring and colonizing Florida. In 1527 Narvaez embarked from Spain with 5 ships and 600 men. It turned out to be a catastrophe. Ultimately, all of the ships were sunk or wrecked by storms. The survivors tried to walk or ride rafts along the edge of the Gulf Coast southward to Mexico. There were only 4 survivors. They arrived in Mexico on July 25, 1536. One of the survivors, Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, returned to Spain, and in 1542 published the first book describing the people, animals, flora and fauna of inland North America in the Relación, published in 1542 and again in 1555. De Vaca described stories that he had heard about a great kingdom to the north, where the temples were made of gold. It was called Cipolla. Later Spaniards called it Cibola. Indeed, the province of the Appalachee Kingdom composing the Chattahoochee River Basin, between present-day Atlanta and Columbus, was called Cipolla. Much of that province was within the Georgia Gold Belt. In 1538, the King of Spain named Hernando de Soto as the new governor of La Florida, plus authorized de Soto to lead an expedition into the interior of southeastern North America, which de Soto was expected to finance. De Soto had accumulated much wealth, while serving as a captain in the conquest of the Inca Empire in South America. The first priority of de Soto and his men was finding gold, silver and gems. The expedition, consisting of at least 620 men, plus 220 horses, a herd of 200 pigs, some mules and a pack of voracious war dogs, landed a little south of the mouth of Tampa Bay, Florida on May 18, 1539. The expedition first headed into the interior of northern Florida, then turned west and spent the winter at the principal Florida Appalachee town of Anahaica. They found very few gold objects in Florida, but just before departing in February 1540, they asked the tribal leaders where they could find gold. They were told that Upaha had much gold and was 14 days' march to the north. That would have placed them in the Appalachee province of Cipolla, which contained the southern end of the Georgia Gold Belt. De Soto's army headed roughly northward until they reached the province of Ocoee. The present state of Georgia was very different than Florida. De Soto's chroniclers commented that the towns were large and well planned with temples, warehouses, streets, plazas, gardens and orchards. The natives were much taller and wore brightly colored clothing, whereas those in Florida wore grass skirts. The chroniclers stated that they never lost sight of houses or cultivated fields in what is now Georgia. This was the southern frontier of the Kingdom of Appalachia. There, De Soto was encouraged to turn eastward to find gold. Once reaching the Muskogee-speaking province of Coffatacheaquee in northeastern South Carolina, the Spaniards were encouraged to turn northwestward. De Soto's expedition was led by native guides across the high mountains of North Carolina into Tennessee and then back into present-day northwest Georgia. They arrived at the edge of Cauchy in July 1540. At the entrance to the enormous town of Cauchy, they were greeted by a large orchestra playing 32 different wind and percussion instruments. Thus, the Native American leaders had hoodwinked De Soto into taking a 780-mile loop around the Appalachee Kingdom, where there was plenty of gold. De Soto asked the leaders of Cauchy where there was gold. He was told to follow the creek, which joined the river at the center of the town of Cauchy, northeastward. This stream is called Talking Rock Creek nowadays. On the other side of the mountain, where Talking Rock Creek sprung, was the beginning of the lands where there was plenty of gold. Cauchy's leaders were telling the absolute truth. So, the Native American guides and a company of De Soto's soldiers waded up Talking Rock Creek for about 15 miles until they came to the foot of the Blue Ridge Mountains. The guides saw warning signs placed by witches, who lived on the mountain. They became frightened and raced back home. Then the Spaniards decided that without native guides they should not proceed further, and so they trekked back to Cauchy. It would be over 100 years later before any Spanish soldiers were allowed in the Appalachee gold fields, and then only a handful of them to guard a fortified trading post. There evidently was another ethnic group living on top of that mountain. Archaeologists have found caves with petroglyphs in them that seem to belong in northern Europe.
Vasquez de Coronado was the governor of the Kingdom of Nueva Galicia, a province of New Spain located northwest of Mexico and comprising the contemporary Mexican states of Jalisco, Sinaloa, and Nayarit. In 1539, he dispatched Friar Marcos de Niza and Estevan, a survivor of the Narvaez expedition, on an expedition north from Compostela toward present-day New Mexico. When de Niza returned, he told of a city of vast wealth, a golden called Cibola, whose Zuni residents were assumed to have murdered Estevan. Though he did not claim to have entered the city of Cibola, he mentioned that it stood on a high hill and that it appeared wealthy and as large as Mexico City. Coronado set out with twin expeditions, which traversed a vast area of the southwestern United States in search of Cibola. He eventually found the town, which consisted of numerous crude adobe houses on a mountain top. The Zuni called this town Hawaka, not Cibola. Apparently, the imaginative friar was vaguely aware of the legends of the 7 golden cities of Cibola in what is now the southeastern United States, then applied the word to the simple adobe settlement.
Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo led the first European expedition that explored what is now the west coast of the United States. Cabrillo departed from the port of Navidad, Mexico on June 27, 1542. 3 months later he arrived at a very good enclosed port, which is known today as San Diego Bay. In 1539, Francisco de Iowa, who had been commissioned by Cortés, explored and named the Sea of Cortés, now the Gulf of California, and reached nearly as far north as the 30th parallel. Cabrillo was then commissioned by the new Viceroy of New Spain, Antonio de Mendoza, to lead an expedition up the Pacific coast in search of trade opportunities, perhaps to find a way to China. The expedition may have reached as far north as the Russian River or even the Columbia, before autumn storms forced them to turn back. While his fleet of 3 ships were anchored at St. Catalina Island, Cabrillo splintered his shin when he stumbled onto a jagged rock. He was trying to rescue some of his men from attacking Tongva warriors. The injury became infected and developed gangrene. He died on January 3, 1543. The earliest maps of California showed it to be part of the North America mainland, but the Gulf of California extending farther north. Within a few years, maps began showing California as a large island. This situation did not change until the early 1760s, when the Spanish government was preparing to colonize Upper California. The initial map shown in this section was from the early 1600s. The first Protestant church in the Western Hemisphere was constructed in the summer of 1564 at Fort Carillon. The fort was built to hold 1,200 residents, but like most early colonizing attempts in North America, the expedition sponsors failed to even ship along enough food for the initial 200 colonists. The fort was in the midst of being dismantled when it was attacked at night by Spanish troops during a storm on September 20, 1565. Most of the colonists inside the fort, except some teenagers and Catholics, were slain. The success of the initial acceptance of Europeans led to more French, Dutch, and English Protestants, plus Sephardic Jews arriving in the mountains. Apparently, some mixed ethnicity families were assigned to outlying towns of the kingdom. At most mountainside terrace complexes, we are finding the stone foundations of 1 to 3 simple European cottages within the community of Native American structures. In 1567, the first Roman Catholic mission, north of Mexico and Cuba, was constructed on what is now called Cumberland Island, Georgia. It was staffed by Jesuits. This occurred 202 years before the first mission in California. Further missions were established up the Georgia coast and on Parris Island, South Carolina. The Jesuits had many conflicts with the native peoples and were eventually replaced by Franciscans. It is a little-known fact that even though the state of Georgia is 37% the size of California, its Catholic mission system had at its peak size over twice as many missions and mission Indians. Yet the mission Indians represented a minuscule percentage of the total indigenous population, since Georgia had a much larger population. The Spanish missions literally exterminated the native peoples in the coastal region of Georgia within a century. The people were forced to work without compensation, growing most of the food for the Spanish colonists in St. Augustine, and constructing their building. Poor nutrition caused diseases to ravage the natives. Pirates and Native American slave raiders attacked the mission Indians, who were considered traitors by the natives within the interior of Georgia. The new European citizens provided their Apalache neighbors and relatives knowledge of European technology. Some of these families formed the town of Melalot, which first appeared on a 1670 European map. The colony continued to be shown on European maps until the early 1700s. It is not known at this time what caused the abandonment of Melalot. Since all households were of mixed ethnicity, its residents could have assimilated into either the Creek or British communities nearby. The probable location of Melalot is Little Mulberry River Park in Gwinnett County, northeast metro Atlanta. Several foundations and chimneys of 17th-century European houses are visible there.
Hello, this is Richard Thornton again. During the past 22 years, I've increasingly focused on uncovering the real history of the Southern Highlands, not just my Native American ancestors. In the process of analyzing ancient ruins, I stumbled upon other people's histories that had been concealed from the public. My Creek Indian grandmother summed it up over 30 years ago. She was angry about the Cherokees claiming to have occupied Etowah Mounds. She shouted, "Why, there were white folks living in the mountains over 100 years before there was such thing as a Cherokee Indian." Well, yes, there were mostly Sephardic Jewish refugees from the Inquisition and men from Asturias, Galicia, Leon, and Portugal, fleeing the poverty created by the Iberian Peninsula's feudal society. My high school history book would have had you believe that Georgia's history began in 1733 when Savannah was founded by Englishmen. Of course, they didn't mention that a few months later the second oldest synagogue in the United States was founded in Savannah. That's just part of the story left out. Those men and women from the Iberian Peninsula brought with them the technology for extracting gold, first developed by the Romans 2,000 years ago. It was first applied to the gold fields of Georgia, and then they took it to California. We will tell you this story.
Cartagena de los Indios, now Cartagena, Colombia, was founded on June 1, 1533. It quickly boomed as a regional seaport, and last stop for galleons hauling gold and silver back to Spain. It became one of 3 cities in the Spanish Empire where it was legal to buy and sell humans from Africa. Over 300,000 slaves were sold in Cartagena before slavery was banned in 1852. Cartagena was also one of those very few cities in the empire where the leaders were tolerant of Jewish subjects practicing their religion in private, as long as they donated generously to the Catholic Church and local politicians. Many Jewish families had grown wealthy from gold, silver and gem mines in the mountains south of Cartagena. Most of the labor was done by indigenous American and African slaves. Of the approximately 6,000 residents of Cartagena in 1610, at least half or more were of Jewish ancestry. Of course, all were officially Roman Catholics, and we have no way of knowing what they did in the privacy of their homes. What we do know is that the high-ranking nobility in Spain, Caribbean Basin and Mexico lusted after the wealth of these crypto-Jews. The easiest way to steal everything that the Jewish families owned was to accuse them of secretly practicing Jewish traditions, never mind that Jesus practiced those same traditions. All assets would be seized by the Inquisition's clergy immediately after a person was accused of heresy or relapsing. If the defendant was found guilty or if dying during the weeks or months of torture, his or her assets were distributed to the king, the informant and the Inquisition. When news reached Cartagena that the Inquisition was setting up shop there and was on their way, terror swept through the city. Supposedly, its population declined by about 1/3, but that was not the whole Jewish population. Supposedly the wealthy families hired Dutch ships to whisk them away to safety, somewhere. Many of the cargo ships were owned or commanded by Jews, but the Dutch, Scottish and French Protestants were also very sympathetic to the persecution of Jews. Did the less affluent Jews, who were wise enough to leave quickly, merely go out into the jungle, far enough to be invisible to soldiers, employed by the Inquisition? We don't know. However, the jurisdiction of this new seat for the Inquisition extended to the entire Caribbean Basin, southeastern North America and northern South America. Thousands of families with Jewish names, Moorish names or some Jewish traditions were in grave danger. Those in danger, who did not leave Cartagena, quickly paid for their hesitance horrifically. Once accused, They were repeatedly interrogated and then tortured for weeks or months. The Inquisition wanted to make a grand show of their power, so a series of mass murders were orchestrated. The killing ceremony was called an auto de fe, or act of faith in English. Good Catholics were expected to show up in large numbers as proof of their religious purity. The excruciating pain of immolation was preceded by a mass, a sermon and then exhortations of individuals to repent, so they would be strangled rather than burned. This ceremony had every element of human sacrifice.
In May 2010, my 3 dogs and I were living at a campsite on Lake Santitla in the Great Smoky Mountains. That is a propane-fired ceramics kiln in the center of the photo. As I camped around the Southern Highlands in 2010 and 2011, I handmade Creek and Maya-style ceramics to pick up extra income. All the colors are made from natural minerals in the mountains. It was a beautiful spring day, so I decided to take the 3 canine musketeers on a hike up on Hooper's Ball Mountain, which has an elevation of 5,430 feet. While up there, I spied boulders and rock faces with lots of graffiti carved on them. There was nothing that looked like Native American. There were dates going back to the late 1700s. At the bottom of one boulder, I noticed a very ancient writing. The date was 1615. It stood out. A closer look revealed more letters to the left of it. They read Predamos Casada Sept 1615. The last part was Spanish and meant married September 1615. I'd never heard of a Spanish word such as Predamos. The following Monday, I went to the county library and went online. The person had left out the R in Darmos, which means we will give. Several months later, I was living in an office of an abandoned chicken house near Track Rock Gap. The office had a bathroom, kitchenette, electrical service, and internet service. I eventually stumbled upon a Sephardic Jewish dictionary online. Whereas Spanish Catholics either use the word supplicación or oración for prayer, Spanish Jews and Protestants use the word pre. The Hooper's Bald inscription reads,
Pre-Darmos, casada 15 de septiembre de 1615.
which mean, prayer we will give, married September 1615. Holy Cartagena, a Sephardic Jewish couple had married on top of Old Smoky in 1615. That was not in the history book.
In 1646, Florida Governor Benito Ruiz de Salazar Vallecilla ordered the construction of a pack mule road from St. Augustine, Florida to the headwaters of the Chattahoochee River and the construction of a fortified trading post where the road met the river. The road later was extended to the Tennessee River to open up trade with the Upper Creeks living there. The portion of this road in northern Georgia and Tennessee is now known as the Unicoi Turnpike. The publicly announced reason for this road was to develop the deer skin and fur trade among the native peoples of the Southern Highlands. Behind the scenes, though, Vallecilla knew that there were many Spanish and Portuguese-speaking miners in the southern mountains. He planned to provide a wide range of European goods to them, then take their gold, silver, copper and gems back to St. Augustine to ship to Spain.
This information is found in the official Florida State History textbook, but not found in the official Georgia textbook.
Edward Bland was a royalist, who spent 5 years in Spain as a wine merchant during the English Civil War. In 1646, he and his wife moved to Jamestown, Virginia. Immediately after arriving there, he paid a visit to Royalist Governor William Berkeley. Then he led a small party to a new trading post at the southern tip of the Appalachian Mountains that he had invested in. This information is in the official Virginia history textbook, but not in the Georgia history textbook. In 1653, English royalist, Richard Brigstock, traveled to the Kingdom of Appalachia, to determine if it was a suitable location for English royalists to establish a colony that was not under the jurisdiction of the English Commonwealth. Brigstock and his colleagues owned plantations, containing many Native American and African slaves on the island of Barbados. He spent almost a year in northern Georgia and the region of North Carolina near Franklin. Both the gold mining villages in Georgia and the gem mining colony near Franklin were inhabited primarily by Spanish-speaking men. Later, Brigstock told of his experiences to Huguenot minister and natural scientist, Charles de Rochefort. In 1658, de Rochefort added 10 chapters to his book on the Caribbean Basin, which told detailed information about the inhabitants, history, flora and fauna of what is now the state of Georgia. Brigstock mentioned that there was a fortified Spanish trading post near the capital of Appalachia. A small Roman Catholic mission stood nearby. Brigstock frequently visited the trading post and mission in order to have conversations with fellow Europeans. The Appalachia did not permit slavery and required all single Europeans to marry indigenous spouses. For these reasons, Brigstock decided to relocate from Barbados to Virginia. Unfortunately, not one Georgia history book or online reference mentions a Spanish trading post and mission being located in northern Georgia.
In 1693, Colonel James Moore of the South Carolina militia led a party of mounted redcoats to explore northeast Georgia, which was then part of South Carolina. When they reached the edge of the Nocouchee Valley, they observed dozens of smoke plumes created by Spanish miners and their Appalachee laborers operating gold smelters. The party being greatly outnumbered, they beat a hasty retreat back to Charleston. This event was duly recorded in the Carolina and British colonial archives. Moore was later appointed the royal governor.
Approximately 450 feet behind the Nocouchee United Methodist Church in the Nocouchee Valley is an ancient burial ground that long predates the large cemetery near the church. At first glance, they appear to be some of the region's many stone cairns, which date back 2,000 to 4,000 years ago. These volcanic fieldstone burial monuments have been severely pilfered over the years by people stealing stones for foundations and chimneys. Those on the edge of the burial grounds are almost gone, but some in the center retain their original form. They're shaped like a sarcophagus, not a round cairn. I did some research. This type of burial is an ancient tradition in Galicia and Asturias in northwestern Iberia, plus the gold-bearing mountains of southwestern Ireland, which were colonized by people from Galicia. It's a tradition going back thousands of years to the early Bronze Age. There are silent but very visible vestiges of who really started the Georgia Gold Rush in the early 1600s.
The official story of the Georgia Gold Rush is replicated across a legion of textbooks and references. In 1828, a newly arrived frontiersman was trespassing on land that had been lived on for thousands of years by the Cherokee people. He found a gold nugget on the bank of the Chattahoochee River. When word of the surprising gold discovery reached Georgia state officials, they stole the gold fields from the Cherokees, then forced them to march on the Trail of Tears to what is now Oklahoma. 30,000 whites poured into the Cherokee country to steal their gold. By 1848, the Georgia gold was gone, so when news reached the mountains of gold being discovered in California, most of the Georgia gold miners abandoned their claims and headed west, never to return home again. Many of those gold miners were Cherokees. Cherokee, California is named after them.
But wait a minute. You just said that all the remaining Cherokees were marched out of Georgia after gold was discovered in 1828? Also, the official story of the Colorado Gold Rush was that it was started in 1858 by a party of whites and Cherokees from Georgia. So, one or the other statements are false.
The lady has a point. In early 1838, federal troops and Georgia militiamen imprisoned every Cherokee they could find. They also illegally arrested Yuchi Indians, living outside the Cherokee Nation, who were citizens of the state of Georgia, and forced them to go on the Trail of Tears. So, how could several hundred Georgia Cherokees 10 years later travel to California to mine gold, and then another large contingent of Georgia Cherokee gold miners travel to Colorado 10 years after then? Richard will answer this question when he discusses the secret history of the Georgia and California gold rushes. However, I wanted to squash one fairy tale that suddenly became a historical fact in the late 20th century. The Cherokee people are not indigenous to the southeastern United States. According to the French colonial archives, they lived in southern Quebec until driven out by the Iroquois in 1650. According to Cherokee Principal Chief Charles Hicks, who wrote a history of the Cherokee people in 1826, the Cherokee entered northeastern Tennessee about the time that Charleston, South Carolina was founded in 1670. The Cherokee did not live in North Carolina until after the 1696 smallpox epidemic killed off many of the indigenous peoples living in the North Carolina mountains. The Cherokee did not live in Georgia until after the American Revolution. Here you see the official 1785 map of Georgia. It shows the Muskogee Creek Confederacy occupying most of northern Georgia, while the Chickasaw occupied the region north of the Coosawhattie and Coosa rivers. Present-day Rabun County is in the Cherokee Nation, but occupied by Yuchi Indians. And now back to Richard.
Thank you, Brian. As a Boy Scout in Gainesville, Georgia, I was one of the young folks in Georgia who planned for gold in Dahlonega to place a gold leaf on the Capitol Dome. Throughout much of my professional career, I assumed that the official stories of the Georgia and California gold rushes were factual stories. Why would anyone back then want to create fake news in Georgia? Also, California claims that gold mining in Georgia was primitive until its miners learned their high technology developed in California. My journey to the truth began when I moved to Dahlonega, Georgia area in 2012. The State Gold Museum is located there, in the old courthouse which was built during the gold rush. In 2013, a lovely young woman came up to me at the Walmart cheese counter in Dahlonega. She looked a lot like Alicia, my first love in Mexico. Black hair, black eyes, natural deep tan. Unfortunately, she was wearing a wedding ring and had 3 children in tow. Cheryl had seen me in the History Channel program and had a question. Her family had always called themselves Cherokee. Some of her ancestors had found enough gold to pay for not having to go to Oklahoma, she claimed. Her great-great-great-granddaddy had also gone to California and come back with enough money to build that big historic house on Cavender Creek Road. She thought it'd be nice if she could get her and her children enrolled in the Eastern Band of Cherokee. Cheryl somehow thought that a DNA test could get her enrolled. It came back that she was more Sephardic Jewish than anything else. Next in order was Northern European Mutt, like most white Southerners. The remainder was Iberian and North African. No wonder she reminded me of Alicia. Alicia's parents were French Sephardic Jews. There are thousands of families in northern Georgia who call themselves Cherokee. Not one of them has ever showed me a DNA test result in which they carried Native American DNA. Around Dahlonega, they typically carry Sephardic or Ashkenazi Jewish DNA. Where I live now, in northeast Georgia, the non-Nordic features come from Portuguese, Asturian, Galician, Basque, or Spanish DNA. All of the families have adopted Anglo-Saxon names. It is obvious that a substantial number of 17th century gold miners remained in the region, and they were predominantly Asturians in northeast Georgia. Until 1833, the official name for the Yonah Mountain was Nakoshi, which is the Creek word for bear. The Alati called Nakoshi Mountain Yonah, which is the Asturian word for mountain lion. Last month I talked to a construction contractor who looked like the slim, moderately short people of northwestern Iberia. He said, "Yes, my people came here before the Cherokees came. We're not Cherokees. Our family changed their name to an English name just before World War I, when there were a lot of lynchings and race riots going on." In 1795, the Cherokees ceded most of their lands in eastern Tennessee in return to giving all the Creek lands west of the Chattahoochee River in North Georgia. Apparently, the Cherokees allowed the Alati to remain on their remote farmsteads. They were in rugged mountain terrain that was not suitable for large-scale cultivation. Getting back to the contrived Georgia gold rush, undoubtedly the old mining families, hidden away in the mountain valleys, continued to pan for gold at secret locations throughout the 1700s. Until 1785, all of the gold belt was in the Creek territory. Certain high-bred South Carolina families knew there was gold in the Coochie Valley. The eyewitness account was in their government archives. Soon, Georgia aristocracy knew it also. They secretly gave the upper part of the gold belt to the Cherokees, but then made a secret deal with the federal government, whereby if the president agreed to move the Cherokees westward by 1805, Georgia would cede the lands that became Alabama and Mississippi. The elderly Cherokee principal chief Pathkiller set up his capital in Alabama, but the young bloods, taking over the tribal leadership from him, stayed put in northwest Georgia. The federal government reneged on the deal, thus Georgia officials became rather nasty in their treatment of the Cherokees. In 1817, Georgia persuaded the Creeks and Cherokees to cede the northern tip of the gold belt, later becoming Rabun, Habersham, Stevens, and White counties. In 1821, a group of North Carolina real estate speculators, many of them gold miners from Burke County, North Carolina, bought most of the Coochie Valley and Tennessee Valley. The occupants of these lands either moved farther south in Georgia or to Creek lands in Alabama. They were obviously not ethnic Cherokees. It's difficult to determine who was living in the mountains during that era. The Iberians and the Jewish families wanted to remain invisible to Anglo-Americans, and very few deeds were registered in the courthouse anyway. The 1821 land sale is strong evidence even the Cherokees recognized that the occupants of the Nacoochee Valley were not ethnic Cherokees. There was a law in place that forbade anyone in the Cherokee Nation but its National Council from selling land, yet the money from the land sale went straight to the occupants of the valley. They only received 10 cents an acre. The fact that the Nacoochee Valley was initially settled by North Carolinians who knew nothing about the valley's early history or the Creek Indians have a profound effect on the interpretation of that valley's history in the future. For starters, they changed the name of Nacoochee Mountain to Yonah Mountain, the Cherokee word for a large bear. Also in 1821, the Creek Confederacy was pressured to cede much of the southern half of the Georgia Gold Belt. Left out of the land cession was the region where Chief McIntosh and his Creek buddies were mining gold. The lands that the Creeks and Cherokees ceded in 1817 and 1821 also included most of what is now the Atlanta metropolitan area. Here is more proof that the Georgia Gold Rush was contrived by a sneaky state government and Vice President John C. Calhoun. The federal government still considered all of the Pink area to be in the Cherokee Nation, even though part of it had been sold to real estate speculators. As soon as the settlers arrived from North Carolina's Gold Belt in 1822, Georgia published a map showing that all of that land east of the Tennessee River was no longer in the Cherokee Nation. The Cherokee National Council protested, but eventually, under pressure from then Secretary of War John C. Calhoun, reluctantly sold the remaining lands there, but stated there would be no more concessions. The General Assembly of Georgia designated the confluence of the Chattahoochee River and Dukes Creek as the location of a newly created Rabun County. The courthouse was to be built over the ruins of the Temple of Mana of the Sun Goddess and the home of the High King of Appalachia. During the next 4 years, wealthy South Carolina and Georgia planters quietly created companies to mine gold. They hired geologists to pinpoint locations of rich gold deposits. They hired mining engineers from Europe to design equipment to extract gold and process it in industrial scale. Most notable among these secret investors was Vice President John C. Calhoun. While in his public position he was one of the most visible advocates of removing all Native Americans to new tribal lands west of the Mississippi, his family-owned company was quietly buying tracts along Dukes Creek and other streams in northeast Georgia for frontier wilderness prices. Calhoun assembled a workforce of at least 100 African-American slaves to do the drudgery. This was typical of all the mining companies being secretly assembled. The work gangs of slaves were to be supervised by so-called Cherokees, who somehow already knew how to extract gold. As stated earlier, it is obvious that these foremen were actually the descendants of 17th century Jewish and Iberian miners. By 1828, Georgia had obtained all the land from the Cherokees where the Spanish were known to have mined gold. Then Governor Troup announced that gold had been found at the confluence of the Chattahoochee River and Dukes Creek. Many thousands of men flocked to the mountain but had to be content to pan for gold dust and nuggets in less likely locations. The gold companies had bought up most of the land along major streams in the Chattahoochee River. The yeoman gold miners in Georgia eventually figured out that panning for gold was not the way to get rich quick. They began to create scaled-down, portable versions of the equipment being used by the planters' gold companies. They also watched the geologists carefully, who were directing company mining teams where to dig. The best place to find gold was not necessarily at the water's edge. Georgia gold is some of the purest in the world. It typically runs from 23 to 23.5 carats, or from 98 to 99% gold. Raw California gold typically runs between 78 and 85% pure. When the United States Mint opened up in Dahlonega in 1838, the purity of Georgia gold proved to be a problem. They had to add other metals to the raw gold in order to make it strong enough to use as coins. Articles on the Georgia Gold Rush typically state that by the time that California started its gold rush, that Georgia had about run out of gold. That is not true. Actually, production was higher than ever, but it was coming from several large mills. The amount of gold found in the alluvial sand beside the river had drastically dropped. So the problem was with the yeoman gold miners, not the gold production as a whole.
It is early spring of 1849. Approximately 200 wagons were parked around the courthouse square. The wagons were carrying the bare necessities of a planned trek, spanning the recently enlarged United States, plus special equipment for separating gold nuggets from California's soil. The travelers were about to start a 2,700-mile journey across the entire continent. They would meet up with other 49ers at the official starting point of the California Trail in Independence, Missouri. Then they would depart on the only safe route, which was being guarded by U.S. Army dragoons. Watching the scene from the second-floor porch of the Lumpkin County Courthouse was Matthew F. Stevenson, assayer for the U.S. Mint in Dahlonega, plus James R. Lawhon and Jacob R. Davis, publishers of the Mountain Signal newspaper. Either Lawhon or Davis shouted,
"Boys, stay here. There is gold in these mountains. Why go all the way to California?"
Stevenson reinforced the plea with,
"Why go to California? In that ridge over there lies more gold than man ever dreamed of. There's millions in it."
The crowd of busy men, even some wives and children, paid little attention to the pleas. One can only imagine what adventures those travelers were about to have. Not one major river had a bridge over it between Dahlonega and the Pacific coast. The Mexican-American War had been over for only a little more than a year. They would be traversing a 4-year-old trail, mapped the previous year by Colonel John C. Fremont. 300 miles of the route would be through territory claimed by the fearsome Comanche. Other tribes could go on the warpath or least on a raid for horses, without warning. However, a 200-wagon convoy, filled with hardy Georgia mountaineers, was not likely to get attacked. Approximately 400 wagons went on the California Trail in 1848. Over 25,000 went in 1849 and 44,000 in 1850. As a result, every water source became contaminated to varying degrees. 1849 was the first year of large-scale cholera epidemics in the United States and the rest of the world, and thousands are thought to have died along the trail on their way to California, most buried in unmarked graves. At some point in the autumn of 1849, the Georgia mountaineers beheld the first range of the majestic Sierra Nevada mountains. Even the foothills of these mountains dwarfed the Georgia mountains, but they lacked the lush vegetation, masses of flowers and bountiful streams that they had come to love. The arid, barren landscapes they had passed through in what is now the states of Utah and Nevada probably made them wonder if the stories they heard about California were all lies. But they were almost there and there was no turning back. We don't know if they attempted crossing the Sierra Nevada in late autumn, which would have been like the dead of winter in the southern Appalachians, or waited till spring. Apparently, very few men among the tough Georgia gold miners died on the way. That was not the case for the eastern townsfolk, who died like flies along the California Trail. At least, on the trail coming down the west slope of the Sierra, there was much more potable water and grass for the livestock to eat.
While the Georgia gold miners are making their way down the west slope of the Sierra Nevada and getting closer views of Mariposa County, we will deviate a moment. Viewers are probably wondering how the articulate comments from the courthouse portico by a newspaper editor and a U.S. government geologist became,
"Well, there's gold in them thar hills."
When the Georgians entered California sometime in late 1849 or early 1850, much of the vast new U.S. territory was in anarchy, but there was also no small clique of wealthy slave owners, politicians and gold processing mill owners grabbing most of the economic benefit of the gold being extracted. In 1847 there were about 5,000 non-indigenous persons in California. That's one-third the population of Georgia's Nacoochee Valley in 1653 AD. Gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill by carpenter James Marshall in January 1848. It took most of that year for word to reach the eastern United States. The new authorities in California were totally unprepared for the human tidal wave that came back from the east in late 1849 and 1850. Very few of these men had any knowledge about extracting gold, digging mines, or even geology. So, a small army of experienced Georgia gold miners shows up on the scene. Their impact would have been far bigger than their numbers. Someone around a campfire told the story of the bigwigs back in Georgia, begging the miners not to leave en masse. Being quite cynical about that scene, the story was passed from mouth to mouth by men who were far less literate than government geologists. Eventually the story reached a young newspaper reporter named Samuel Clemens. Most people know him better by his pen name, Mark Twain. He worked for newspapers in San Francisco and in the High Sierra, could have been either place. Clemens incorporated the statement and the personality of U.S. Mint assayer Matthew Stevenson into the character of Colonel Mulberry Sellers. Somehow, the statement has become permanently affixed in American folklore and in the performing arts. This nature conservation area in Mariposa today is what the Georgians would have seen during most of their journey through the Sierra foothills. It is highly probable that the Georgia miners entered the California gold fields through what soon became Mariposa County. Mariposa is a Spanish word that means butterfly in English. On September 9, 1850, Peter H. Burnett, the first governor of California, signed the law creating 27 original counties. At the time, Mariposa comprised 1/5 of the territory of California. This is the original 1850 map of the gold-bearing regions of the California Territory. Mariposa County is at the southern end of the map. For decades, California authors have assumed that any Georgia miners who returned to their state brought with them the advanced technology for gold extraction developed in California. Because of multiple replications and references, their speculations have become historical fact. Actually, the reason that as many as 2,000 Georgia miners went to California in the earliest stages of its gold rush was that industrial-scale excavations by companies, such as the one owned by Vice President Calhoun, had eaten up all the prime alluvial, gold-bearing soils. After construction of the U.S. Mint in the Georgia Gold Belt during 1838, gold extraction had shifted to capital-intensive tunneling to reach deposits of soil, rich in gold nuggets. In 1845, Georgia gold miner Nathan Hand got the idea that there had to be a better way to extract gold, and he found one. Using a series of pipes and ditches, gravity flow water pressure could be used to wash away mountains and get more material to feed into the sluices. The main hydraulic system involved a pipe and ditch system that spanned 26 miles. Wikipedia tells readers that hydraulic mining was invented in California and later introduced by returning miners to Georgia. The most widely used device introduced into California by the Georgia miners was the rocker box. It mimicked much larger equipment used by the big gold mining companies in Georgia, but seems to have evolved from a device used by the 17th century Sephardic and Iberian gem miners to separate rubies, sapphires, and other precious stones from red Georgia clay. Some variations of the rocker box in both Georgia and California utilized much longer sluice trays, but these would have not fit into the wagons going west to California. There is very little that can be said definitively about how many Georgians stayed in California, how many returned home, and how many continued mining in other parts of the West. It is a documented fact that numerous miners claiming to be Cherokees from Georgia stayed in California. The town of Cherokee, California is named after them. However, our research strongly suggests that these men were actually Iberians and Sephardic Jews with darker complexions than most of the other miners. A team of Georgia miners returning home from California definitely started the Colorado Gold Rush. They founded communities with the same names that they lived in while in Georgia. On the other hand, there are hundreds of family stories around Georgia of men who returned home fabulously rich. They bought large farms and built mansions. They built factories in northwest Georgia. They started stores and banks. Stephen D. Cohen of Ackworth, Georgia, was one of those men who came home rich. He purchased a 1,200-acre tract of land and built this farmhouse on it. Richard Thornton was the architect for its restoration. He then built a palatial Greek Revival mansion near downtown and a steam-operated mill on the railroad tracks.
Thank you, Ben. That was very interesting. You know, my former cabin near Dahlonega, Georgia, was close to an old canal running through mature forests. We knew that it had something to do with the hydraulic mining, but had no clue that it was built in 1845 and was 26 miles long, an amazing engineering feat for that era. The other day I learned something fascinating information from the Georgia Gold Museum, which is in the old Lumpkin County Courthouse. Until 1858, when the San Francisco Mint opened for business, California miners were frequently ripped off by private sector merchants and gold buyers. Most of the Georgia miners literally hauled their California gold back to Dahlonega, Georgia, to sell it. Many carried the equivalent today of several $100,000, even $1 million, across the entire continent. The Dahlonega Mint needed the California gold desperately because Georgia gold was far too pure to make coins. They mixed the California gold with the Georgia gold to make coins, which were 90% gold. Then after the Civil War, the federal government refused to reopen the Dahlonega Mint. However, the Transcontinental Railroad had united the nation. The principal customer for Georgia gold was the San Francisco and Denver mints, who were buying Georgia gold to bring their coins up to 90% pure. An enormous gold plant opened up in Dahlonega in the 1890s just to supply the United States mints with very pure gold. It's rather symbolic if you think about it. California and Georgia, just two sides of the same coin. Thank you, folks. Hope you enjoyed our program.